So in this class on nonfiction prose, I've really focused on metaphor, the key role of metaphor in nonfiction prose. And that might sound surprising. Nonfiction means writing about reality, representation of reality, whereas metaphor means figurative, not literal language, and not speaking objectively, but figuratively, making imaginative comparisons, representing by analogy to other things, trying to evoke similarities and qualities, suggestive qualities of things, rather than pretending to name things directly. So why is metaphor important to nonfiction prose? Why don't we just look at nonfiction prose in terms of objective, literal representation of facts? Well, there's kind of a more philosophical reason and then a more historical reason. The philosophical reason is that life is always unfolding. So the reality that we want to represent in nonfiction prose is always incomplete. So if we pretended to represent it objectively, that would give it a completeness, an appearance of finality that it would not be true to reality, would be fictional. And that's the critique that Ian McGilchrist makes about language, the critique that he makes of the three L's: language, logic, and linearity. These are tools that are very effective for breaking things down, seeing how they work in isolation from life, in a kind of clinical remove under controlled circumstances, fixing things in language, noticing logical or linear causal relationships is very powerful and effective in terms of manipulating reality, but you can only do it in controlled circumstances. In the real flow of life, the flow of life is characterized by chance, random accidents, chaos, that do not admit of definitive representation in the three L's. This is what Edward St. Aubin suggests in the epigram to Barbarian Days. The way in which the building of sentences misrepresents the actual flow of experiences. So notice here the difference between that. Just notice the use of metaphor in this sentence. He'd become so caught up in building sentences that he'd almost forgotten the barbaric days when thinking was like a splash of color landing on the page. So we see a contrast between sentences, building, like manufacturing, versus the kind of vitality of color and the splash, but also the event. The splash of color is an event, like life. Built sentences are static and again are powerful for analyzing and breaking things down in their constituent parts, and like naming causal relationships and logical relationships. But that flow of experience, the event of the splash, is something that we rely on metaphor, rely on various kinds of figurative language, which is to say poetry, basically, um, to evoke by comparison this unfolding of time, what it's like to be in time, um, and for life to unfold and to happen. Um, is we're using a static when we try to represent that in language, that unfolding of life. We're using a static medium to name a dynamic experience. That's why, metaphor means transporting, um, to carry across. It means like communication. That movement across is characteristic of poetry. That's what, or music. That getting moved by language, letting the metaphor, letting yourself think about the metaphor and see where it takes you. That's a movement, an experience. It's an event, like life. That's why we rely on metaphors to evoke real experience. So that's the philosophical reason. The historical reason why metaphors are crucial for nonfiction um, is that has to do with the idea of systemic inequality that has become so current um, in discussion of politics today. Systemic racism, systemic sexism. Certain people have been excluded from language, and so pretending to speak objectively is implicitly misrepresenting reality, because you're using a biased language. So metaphors are required to evoke that systemic bias of language, or to try to gesture beyond language's own limits. Um, no word is more representative of that limitation on language than barbarism. The word is the flip side of the word civilization, or reality, like what we mean when we speak of what is true. Barbarism names what's outside that, what is outside of proper language. Barbarism is the word barbaric is an onomatopoeia for people that don't speak language, that just sound like they're babbling. So the theme of barbarism is an exploration of the limits of civilization, these themes of systemic inequality, systemic exclusion. To say, when we speak, we're always saying implicitly, we're asserting our membership in a certain linguistic community. That's to say, a certain representation of what's real and true, a certain consensus or social contract regarding what counts as true and normal. That what matters, to use the central term of these contemporary social movements. What's included in mattering. So we're always naming, whenever we speak, we're always naming, we're always representing implicitly a certain picture, certain incomplete picture of what's real. Necessarily incomplete. That's language is able to communicate only because it doesn't say everything all at once, right? Speak in order to assure ourselves and each other that we are commonly participating in the same community. We communicate in order to confirm what community means, that could to confirm the actuality of community. Um, and so I like this cartoon because it sort of suggests the same thing. It's about a person that's annoyed by all the um, animal noise early in the morning, um, and thinks about that noise in terms of animals just affirming who they are. I'm a bird, I'm a bird, I'm a dog, I'm a squirrel, I'm a horse. So this Finnegan's epigram for barbarian days uh, contrasts the mere sentence building, the three L's, objective, uh, um, logical, linear explanation and representation. Um, Contrast that with color, with splash, the event of splash and the sensuality of color. Um, that's what overflows the mere objective representation. Um, I thought last night Kamala Harris selected to vice president, um, and there's pretty. So vice president means she's a representative. She's a representative of the people. She's like a metaphor for the people in a way. I think that's a one. That's a uh, an aspect of political representation is this metaphor. Our representatives are sort of metaphors for us, um, uh, and this symbolic function is really important. So it was made really evident in her appearance last night. There's an article about it in the New York Times about her outfit. The white pantsuit it has a long history of affiliation with the suffragette the movement, women's rights movement, going back to the early 20th century. So speaking for or symbolizing those excluded from representation. Um, so this it's a white pantsuit like that's doesn't sound like nonfiction. That sounds like ornamentation, um, style. Doesn't sound like objective representation of reality. What does a white pantsuit have to do with that? But in fact, I think she's she's speaking for, symbolizing with this active symbolic solidarity. She's speaking for these people that have been excluded from representation for so long, and continuing insofar as sexism still matters. Um, so in that sense, it's the opposite of mere ornamentation. It's kind of the most important kind of representation because it's representing what the normal system of language, what's left out of the normal system of representation. It's getting at what's sort of the most crucial aspect of reality because it's unspoken for. And Thoreau likewise says here, perhaps the facts most astounding and most real are never communicated by man to man. What really matters is not what we actually say, what we actually consciously know and intentionally articulate. Instead, throw again, like the metaphor of the splash of color. Thoreau suggests that what matters the most is, again, he uses a metaphor. It's the light, intangible, and indescribable tints of morning or evening. This passing moment. It's not something you can fix and hold on to. It's an event, like a splash, the tint of the morning or evening. It comes and goes. And that's what I want to suggest about Kamala Harris. It's an event. She wears the outfit. That says something. The event of doing that action, says something. Maybe a lot more than what she actually said, what she explicitly said. Here's another example of why objective representation is misleading. This is from another book from Alison Gopnik called The Philosophical Baby. So it has to do with what psychologists call counterfactuals, which is sort of another word for imagination. What you imagine as opposed to what's, factually the case. So consider this. Medalists in the Olympics. Who's happier, the bronze medalist or the silver? You'd think that objectively the silver medalist, who after all has actually done better, would be happier. But the relevant counterfactuals are very different for the two. For the bronze medalist, the relevant alternative was to finish out of the medals altogether, a fate she just escaped. For the silver medalist, the relevant alternative was the gold medal, a fate she just missed. And in fact, when psychologists took clips of the medal ceremony and analyzed the facial expressions of the athletes, it turned out that the bronze medalists really do look happier than silver medalists. The difference in what might have been outweighs the difference in what is. So get this, that's really revealing. What might have been matters more than what is. The counterfactual scenario, what didn't happen, actually matters more than what did happen. So the expectations we bring to experience, the counterfactual things we imagine, anticipate, desire, as well as fear, go so far to determining what the experience is, even when, or especially because our expectations may be totally unrealistic, like the kiwi bird's dreams of flying. We have dreams of justice, of love, and many things which arguably might, are unrealistic or might never happen, improbable. But they, aside from the question of whether, we realize them in life, they, our expectations, desires, hopes, and fears, aside entirely from the question of their plausibility, go so far to determining what, how our lives play out. There's another good example. One of the best climbers in the world talking about the most scared he's ever been. Listen to what he has to say.
Father, to discover that climbing, fear for yourself in climbing is not actually all that scary. Being scared for someone else that you care about is far, far more scary. So the most scared I've ever been by an order of magnitude was when my daughter fell out of her pram and fell down a set of stairs when she was 1 or 2. But the next morning, she was absolutely fine and, no lasting damage. Actually, if I think about it directly, I still get quite upset. So that's such as the lasting scar that it leaves on my mind, despite the fact that there was actually no long-term consequences.
So that's quite amazing, I think. This guy who's, such an amazing climber, has done all these super scary things. And um, what scares him the most and still scares him is something that never even happened. It's just something he imagined. Um, and so I want to, I'm just trying to emphasize, give you examples for how much to use again the metaphor of color, from the epigram to barbarian days, how much our experience, our real experience, is colored by things that might not be objectively real. Uh, this is Chief Plentycou, who's the leader of the Crow tribe, when they were forced onto reservations by the United States government. He was a great diplomat and visionary. There's a very interesting book of philosophy about him called Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. Plentycou refused to speak of his life after the passing of the buffalo, so that his story seems to have been broken off, leaving many years unaccounted for. "I've not told you half of what happened when I was young," he said, when urged to go on. "I can think back and tell you much of war and horse stealing, but when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. There was little singing anywhere besides." He added sorrowfully, "You know that part of my life as well as I do. You saw what happened to us when the buffalo went away." So to say that nothing happened, after going on the reservation, nothing happened, history stopped. The pursuit of cultural, the relevant pursuit of cultural meaning, of significant events, stopped happening. And so this is correlated with the buffalo, because as nomads, the crows followed the buffalo, but the buffalo were not the exclusive source of meaning and value. A whole cultural system of nomadic warrior values were built up upon the practice of tracking and hunting buffalo, especially this tradition of counting coups, which has to do with a kind of honorable fighting. To count coup, a warrior had to strike an armed enemy before otherwise harming him. That's to say, to create symbolic value out of the fighting. So fighting is not just about winning, but about acquiring honor. So the phrase "to count coup" was used ambiguously to name any of these brave acts, and to name a ritual ceremony after the battle, in which each of these warriors, sitting in a circle, recounted his coup. He then planted a feather in front of himself, one for each of his coups. So I think this is really crucial, the way in which cultural prestige and purpose and meaning is built up in excess, as an excess value, in over and above the mere natural resource. So by taking away the buffalo or removing the crow from their nomadic way of life, it's not just about taking away the natural resources, but a whole system of cultural activity, of pursuit of cultural meaning. This those counterfactuals that frame and direct our activity and give events meaning, inform both our desires and our fears. That's all taken away. It's erasure of or decimation of cultural meaning, or depletion of cultural meaning, reduction to scarce, homogenized sources of value, ultimately money, extractive resources and money. Characterize the cultural decimation of the Hawaiians, and Native Americans. And it's a subtext, I think. I'd like you to think of it as a subtext. Well, announced in the title of Barbarian Days. This marginalization, this exploration of the boundaries of civilization, the exploration of what counts as barbaric, the excluded and delegitimized forms of cultural meaning. So Finnegan thematizes his loss of religion. He how he was scandalized when, after confirmation, his parents tell him that he doesn't need to go to church anymore if he doesn't want to, and how surfing kind of takes the place of church, and becomes a new source of what had been his religious feeling. So I'd like you to think about how surfing and other sorts of experiences are described in ways that might reconstruct cultural meaning, the kind of cultural meaning that has been erased by, or is significantly depleted or reduced by first world consumerist industrial culture. So listen to this passage from the first chapter, talking about surfing. Everything out there was disturbingly interlaced with everything else. Just that idea of interconnection. So whereas wanting to, as opposed to reducing everything to an objective measure, he's talking about a disturbing experience of the interrelationship of everything. I think that's pretty interesting. So waves were the playing field, they were the goal. They were the object of your deepest desire and adoration. At the same time, they were your adversary, your nemesis, even your mortal enemy. The surf was your refuge, your happy hiding place, but it was also a hostile wilderness, a dynamic, indifferent world. At 13, I'd mostly stopped believing in God, but that was a new development, and it left a hole in my world, a feeling that I'd been abandoned. The ocean was like an uncaring God, endlessly dangerous, power beyond measure. And yet, you were expected, even as a kid, to take its measure every day. And so really interesting combinations of opposed contradictory terms: measure and measurelessness, the goal, your refuge, your adversary, your nemesis. So surfing exposes Finnegan to a disturbing interconnectedness of things that he thought belonged apart. The playing field and the goal, the refuge and the nemesis, and what you can measure and what you can't. And he associates this with, something like religion, taking place of the, religion he'd lost. Later, he interestingly mentions that he meets some proper Catholic schoolboys around LA. He didn't, although he was raised Catholic, he didn't go to Catholic school. But he says he's scandalized by these Catholic schoolboys' lack of religion, and says evidently it took Catholic school to turn young kids into fearless, hardened apostates. I was a public school wimp, still cowed by nuns. So that's sort of the idea I've suggested to you before, that kids or people generally learn in spite of their instruction, learn in spite of their teaching. So it's precisely Catholic school that teaches kids to be heretics, and the vestige of faith that Finnegan retains is precisely because he didn't go to Catholic school. So here's how Finnegan narrates his loss of religion. Let's see. Around my 13th birthday, I received the sacrament of confirmation, becoming an adult in the eyes of the church, and was thunderstruck to hear my parents say that I was no longer required to go to Mass. The decision was now mine. Were they not worried about the state of my soul? Their evasive, ambiguous answers shocked me again. They'd been big fans of Pope John the 23rd, but they did not, I realized, actually believe in all the doctrine and prayers, all those oblatios, oratios, frightening confiteors, and mealy-mouthed acts of contrition that I'd been memorizing and struggling to understand since I was small. It was possible that they didn't even believe in God. I immediately stopped going to Mass. God was not visibly upset. My parents continued to drag the little ones to church. Such hypocrisy. This joyful ditching of my religious obligations happened shortly before we moved to Hawaii. And so, on a spring Sunday morning, I found myself slowly paddling back from cliffs. So, just want to underscore this. And so indicates a narrative consequence, a succession in time, maybe just an association. It doesn't necessarily indicate, a causal determination, but some kind of loose association. And this is really, really beautiful. One of my favorite passages of the book here that follows. Describing a new form of religious experience, something like something for which religion might be a metaphor. Found myself slowly paddling back from cliffs through the lagoon while my family sweated it out up at Star of the Sea in Waialae. The tide was low, my skeg gently bumped on the bigger rocks. Out on the exposed reef, wearing conical straw hats, Chinese ladies, or maybe they were Filipinas, bent, collecting eels and octopus in buckets. Waves broke here and there along the reef's outer edge, too small to surf. I found myself floating between two worlds. There was the ocean, effectively infinite, falling away over the horizon. This morning it was placid, its grip on me loose and languorous. But I was lashed to its moods now. The attachment felt limitless, irresistible. I no longer thought of waves being carved in celestial workshops. I was getting more hard-headed. Now I knew they originated in distant storms which moved, as it were, upon the face of the deep. But my utter absorption in surfing had no rational content. It simply compelled me. There was a deep mine of beauty and wonder in it. Beyond that, I could not have explained why I did it. I knew vaguely that it filled a psychic cavity of some kind, connected perhaps with leaving the church, or with, more likely, this slow drift away from my family, and that it had replaced many things that came before it. I was a sunburnt pagan now. I felt privy to mysteries. The other world was land, everything that was not surfing, books, girls, school, my family, friends who did not surf, society, as I was learning to call it, and the exactions of Mr. Responsible. Hands folded under my chin, I drifted. Notice that dual use of drifting. So one is the metaphor for another. A bruise-colored cloud hung over Cocoa Head. A transistor radio twanged on a seawall where a Hawaiian family picnicked on the sand. The sun-warmed, shallow water had a strange, boiled vegetable taste. The moment was immense, still, glittering, mundane. I tried to fix each of its parts in memory. I did not consider, even passingly, that I had a choice when it came to surfing. My enchantment would take me where it chose. So you can see the same contrast between sort of the static, explicit currency of society, Emerson's, joint stock company of conventional values, and on the other hand, the drifting, the mystery, the pagan enchantment and compulsion, the compelling mysteries of drifting, the natural world, the ocean, being lashed to the ocean. Like he said before, interlaced. Everything is interlaced with everything else. These formal metaphors of webbing, intermeshing, replace the rigid conceptual categories. So the pagan mysteries are contrasted with the, conceptual terms of normative currency of society, but the mysteries themselves represent a kind of different logic in which, again, everything is interlaced with everything else. And this interlacing, like the drifting on the water, is a kind of rhythm. It's a kind of movement and a sensuous embodied experience. He refers to it also in terms of his experience of the geography of the land. Listen to what he says here. Directions in Honolulu were always given, though, in terms of local landmarks, not the compass. So you went Mocha toward the mountains, or Makai toward the sea, or Ewa toward Ewa Beach, which was out past the airport in Pearl Harbor, or Diamond Head. Among those of us living on the far side of Diamond Head, people just said Cocoa Head, same difference. These picturesque directions weren't slang or affectations. You saw them on official maps and street signs. And they were also, for me, and my sense of this was unformed but strong, a salient piece of a world more unitary for all its fractiousness, a world more coherent in its mid-Pacific isolation than any I'd known before. I miss my friends in LA, but Southern California and its sprawling, edgeless blandness was losing its baseline status in my mind. It was no longer the place by which all other places had to be measured. Again, that term measure. Um, so, um, this, I think this is interesting to think about this. Landmarks, not of the compass. What's the difference between taking your orientation from landmarks rather than the compass? I think that indicates something about what he means by interlaced, the interlaced experience of nature and meaning. Like the contrast between the barbarian and the civilized in civilization, the distinction between meaning and land, between purpose, your personal sense of purpose and meaning, and the rhythms of the weather and the sea, the environment, this interpenetration, interlacing, finding meaning in the environment, being lashed to its moods, finding moods in the environment, and finding oneself lashed to them. I like these terms, interlacing and lashed. It's like a kind of, he's describing himself as kind of artificially, prosthetically connected to the environment. He's using the artifice of his writing to describe an artificial kind of interpenetration of himself and the environment, his mind, the world of meanings that gets represented in language, and the world of sense experience in the environment and in the water.